They called him the boss of bosses. But his real power came from something more dangerous than any title. He was the ghost no one saw coming. In 1904, in the poverty-stricken streets of Naples, Italy, Francesco Tieri was born into a world where survival meant choosing sides. The old country was dying, strangled by corruption, poverty, and the iron grip of secret societies that ruled through fear and blood. His family, like millions of others, saw America as salvation. In 1911, they made the crossing, packed into steerage with hundreds of desperate souls, arriving at Ellis Island with nothing but hope and the understanding that in the new world, you built your own destiny or you starved. They settled in Lower Manhattan, in the neighborhood that would become known as Little Italy, a place where the old country rules transplanted themselves into American soil. Young Frank grew up speaking Italian at home and English in the streets, navigating two worlds, belonging fully to neither. He watched as neighborhood toughs collected protection money, as shopkeepers paid tribute to stay safe, as police walked past crimes because their pockets were already filled with mob cash. The lesson was clear. Legitimate society was a lie. Real power operated in the shadows. Unlike other kids who dreamed of escaping the neighborhood, Frank saw opportunity in it. He was smart, scary smart, and he understood that in organized crime, brains lasted longer than muscle. He didn't want to be the guy breaking legs or hijacking trucks. He wanted to be the guy who decided whose legs got broken and which trucks got hijacked. By his late teens, Frank Tieri was already working for local mob crews, running numbers, handling collections, proving himself useful without drawing attention. The 1920s and Prohibition transformed organized crime in America. Suddenly, selling booze, something that had always been legal, became the most profitable illegal business in the country. Criminal organizations that had survived on gambling, prostitution, and extortion exploded into multi-million-dollar empires overnight. And in New York, 5 families emerged to divide the territory and the profits: Luciano, Mangano, Galliano, Profeci, and Bonanno. Frank Tieri aligned himself with what would eventually become the Genovese family, at that time led by Charles Lucky Luciano, the visionary who transformed Italian organized crime from ethnic street gangs into the sophisticated criminal enterprise known as La Cosa Nostra. Luciano understood that the old mustache Petes, traditional Sicilian bosses who clung to old country ways, were holding back progress. He organized their elimination, created the commission to settle disputes between families, and built a structure that prioritized profit over ethnic loyalty. Tieri watched and learned. He saw how Luciano operated, not as a street thug but as a criminal CEO, managing territories like a corporation managed divisions. He saw how power flowed not just from violence, but from relationships, from knowing who controlled what, from understanding the intricate web of alliances and debts that held the underworld together. And most importantly, he learned that the smartest gangsters were the ones nobody knew. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, Tieri rose quietly through the ranks. He handled labor union rackets, managed gambling operations, oversaw loan sharking operations, and built relationships with politicians, judges, and police officials. He wasn't flashy. He didn't wear expensive suits or drive Cadillacs or throw parties. He lived modestly, worked constantly, and proved himself reliable. In the mob, reliability was more valuable than any amount of violence. When Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy in 1946, the family passed through several leaders before Vito Genovese consolidated power in the 1950s. Genovese was old school, paranoid, brutal, and obsessed with respect. He saw enemies everywhere and responded to perceived slights with violence, but he also recognized talent when he saw it, and Frank Tieri had talent. Genovese promoted Tieri into the family's upper ranks, putting him in charge of major operations and using him as a trusted advisor. Tieri's strength was in management. He could run complex criminal enterprises efficiently, resolve disputes without unnecessary violence, and most importantly, keep law enforcement at bay. While Genovese was the public face and the feared name, Tieri worked behind the scenes, ensuring the machinery ran smoothly. But working for Genovese was dangerous. The boss's paranoia led to unnecessary wars with other families, drew federal attention, and created instability. In 1957, the disastrous Appalachian Meeting, where dozens of top mobsters were caught gathering at a rural estate, put organized crime on the front page and gave the FBI ammunition to finally acknowledge the Mafia existed. Tieri attended that meeting, one of the many bosses caught fleeing through the woods. It was a humiliation, but it was also a learning experience. The old ways didn't work anymore. When Genovese was arrested and convicted on narcotics charges in 1959, he continued ruling the family from prison through a series of acting bosses. Tieri served loyally, managing operations, handling disputes, generating revenue. But he was also watching, waiting, understanding that Genovese's grip was weakening. In the mob, leadership changes aren't announced in board meetings. They happen in the shadows, through whispered conversations and subtle shifts in allegiance. Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969, and the family needed new leadership. But by this point, the FBI was sophisticated, wiretaps were everywhere, and being a visible mob boss was a death sentence, either legal through RICO prosecution or literal through rival bullets. The Genovese family needed someone smart enough to lead, but invisible enough to survive. Frank Tieri was the perfect choice. He had been around for decades, knew every operation, commanded respect from captains and soldiers, and most importantly, he understood how to operate in the new reality. He became official boss of the Genovese family in 1972, but unlike previous bosses, he didn't announce it, didn't seek recognition, didn't make himself a target. He operated through layers of insulation, using acting bosses and front bosses, maintaining plausible deniability. His leadership style was revolutionary for the mob. Instead of grand gestures and public displays of power, Tieri ran the family like a covert intelligence operation. Orders passed through multiple layers. Money moved through complex laundering schemes. Operations were compartmentalized so that nobody knew the full picture except Tieri himself. He rarely met with soldiers directly, communicated through trusted intermediaries, and never put anything in writing. Under Tieri's leadership, the Genovese family became the most powerful and sophisticated criminal organization in America. They controlled labor unions, infiltrated legitimate businesses, ran gambling and loan sharking operations across multiple states, and generated hundreds of millions in annual revenue. But you wouldn't know it from looking at Tieri. He lived in a modest apartment in Greenwich Village, dressed conservatively, and maintained such a low profile that most Americans had never heard his name. In the 1970s, the Five Families Commission, the governing body created by Lucky Luciano decades earlier, faced unprecedented challenges. Federal pressure was intensifying. Internal disputes threatened to explode into wars, and the old rules that had maintained peace were being tested. The commission needed leadership, someone respected enough to make decisions that all families would accept. Frank Tieri became that leader. Without any official title or public acknowledgement, he became known in mob circles as the boss of bosses, not because he commanded the other families, but because his wisdom, Experience and reputation made him the de facto mediator and decision-maker. When families had disputes, they came to Tieri. When major decisions needed to be made, Tieri's voice carried the most weight. This was unprecedented power. Previous attempts at creating a boss of bosses had ended in violence. The position was seen as too threatening, too dangerous to the autonomy of individual families. But Tieri achieved it through respect rather than force. He didn't demand obedience. He earned consensus. He didn't threaten, he convinced. And most importantly, he never made it official, never claimed the title publicly, never gave anyone a reason to challenge his authority. His influence extended beyond New York. Mob families in New Jersey, Philadelphia, Chicago, and Los Angeles sought his counsel on major decisions. When territorial disputes arose, Tieri's word settled them. When wars threatened to break out, Tieri negotiated peace. He became the closest thing the American Mafia had to a supreme leader, all while maintaining such a low profile that law enforcement barely understood his role. While other families focused on traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, Tieri understood that the real money was in infiltrating legitimate industries. Under his leadership, the Genovese family penetrated deep into labor unions, construction, trucking, garment manufacturing, waste management, and waterfront operations. The Teamsters Union, the Laborers Union, the Hotel Workers Union, Genovese influence ran through all of them. This gave Tieri power over entire industries. If you wanted to build in New York, you paid tribute through inflated contracts. If you wanted goods delivered, you used Genovese-connected trucking. If you wanted labor peace, you negotiated with Genovese-controlled unions. It wasn't extortion in the traditional sense. It was systemic corruption so deeply embedded that it became the cost of doing business. The genius of this approach was that it generated massive, consistent revenue with relatively low risk. Unlike selling powder or crystal, which brought heat from narcotics agents, labor racketeering was harder to prosecute. The money moved through legitimate companies. The violence was minimal and strategic, and the connections to organized crime were difficult to prove. Tieri had created a criminal empire that operated in plain sight, hidden behind layers of legitimate business. The construction industry alone generated tens of millions annually for the family. Concrete, steel, carpentry, electrical work, every aspect of building in New York involved paying the mob. The famous Concrete Club, a cartel of construction companies that rigged bids and inflated prices, was essentially a Genovese operation. Major projects like skyscrapers and housing developments paid millions in hidden tribute, all flowing back to Tieri and his captains. Tieri understood something many gangsters didn't. Politicians were more valuable than any amount of muscle. Under his guidance, the Genovese family built relationships with officials at every level: city councilmen, state legislators, judges, district attorneys, even federal officials. These weren't crude bribery schemes. They were sophisticated relationships built over years through campaign contributions, favors, and mutual interests. When the family needed a case to disappear, calls were made to judges. When investigations got too close, prosecutors suddenly lost interest. When zoning laws needed to change, city council members discovered new perspectives. The beauty of the system was its subtlety. Nothing was obvious. Everything was deniable. And the corruption was so systemic that proving it required dismantling the entire structure. Tieri also maintained relationships with legitimate business leaders who benefited from mob connections. Real estate developers who needed construction permits, businessmen who needed union cooperation, corporations that needed problems solved. They all found that working with the Genovese family, indirectly and deniably, made life easier. This created a network of respectable citizens who had a vested interest in protecting Tieri's operations. The political connections also provided intelligence. Tieri often knew about investigations before they started, understood which prosecutors were ambitious and which were controllable, and could predict when pressure was coming. This early warning system allowed the family to adjust operations, clean up exposure, and stay ahead of law enforcement. Throughout his reign, Tieri maintained an almost obsessive commitment to invisibility. He avoided being photographed, rarely appeared in public places where surveillance might catch him, and conducted business through intermediaries whenever possible. While other bosses like John Gotti would later embrace media attention and play to their celebrity, Tieri understood that fame was a death sentence in modern organized crime. His daily routine reflected this discipline. He didn't maintain lavish offices or obvious headquarters. Instead, he operated from various locations: social clubs, restaurants, apartments, rotating regularly to avoid surveillance. When he met with associates, it was in carefully chosen locations, often while walking in parks or driving in cars where wiretaps were difficult. He never discussed business on phones, never put anything in writing, never gave law enforcement the evidence they needed. This discipline extended to his soldiers and captains. Tieri demanded that family members maintain low profiles, avoid unnecessary violence that attracted attention, and prioritize long-term profit over short-term gains. Under his leadership, the Genovese family had fewer high-profile killings, fewer headline-grabbing crimes, and less law enforcement pressure than other families. It was boring, but it was profitable and sustainable. The FBI struggled to even confirm Tieri's role. While they knew he was important, the exact nature of his position remained unclear for years. Traditional surveillance methods, wiretaps, informants, physical surveillance, produced frustratingly little useful intelligence. Tieri's insulation was so complete that even family members often didn't know they were following his orders. One of Tieri's greatest achievements was preventing wars. In the 1970s, New York's mob families faced numerous flashpoints that could have exploded into violence. Territorial disputes, business conflicts, personal grievances between powerful mobsters. Historically, these disputes ended in bloodshed, with wars that devastated families and brought federal heat. But Tieri's influence on the commission allowed him to mediate conflicts before they escalated. When the Colombo family faced internal strife, Tieri helped negotiate settlements. When disputes arose over gambling territories, Tieri brokered compromises. When ambitious captains in various families started making moves that could trigger violence, Tieri used his authority to rein them in. This wasn't altruism. It was strategy. Wars were bad for business. They attracted attention, destabilized operations, and got people killed or arrested. Tieri understood that mob families made more money cooperating than fighting. By maintaining peace, he ensured that all families, including his own, could focus on profit rather than survival. His success in this role reinforced his position as the de facto boss of bosses. Family bosses trusted his judgment because his advice consistently led to better outcomes than violence would have achieved. Even ambitious mobsters who chafed under his authority recognized that challenging Tieri meant potentially facing all 5 families, making any move against him essentially suicidal. By the late 1970s, the FBI's approach to organized crime had evolved dramatically. The introduction of RICO statutes in 1970 gave prosecutors new weapons. They could now charge entire organizations rather than just individual crimes, connecting bosses to criminal enterprises even without direct evidence of specific acts. And the FBI was developing new investigative techniques: long-term surveillance, sophisticated wiretaps, turning witnesses through pressure and protection programs. Frank Tieri became a priority target. FBI agents spent years building a case, tracking his movements, identifying his associates, documenting the structure of the Genovese family. They couldn't catch him committing crimes directly. He was too insulated for that. But RICO didn't require it. They just needed to prove he was the boss of a criminal enterprise, and that the enterprise committed crimes. In 1980, the hammer dropped. Federal prosecutors indicted Frank Tieri as the boss of the Genovese crime family, using RICO statutes to charge him with running a criminal enterprise. It was a landmark case, the first time a mob boss would be prosecuted under RICO at the federal level. The indictment marked the beginning of the end for the traditional Mafia's reign. The trial exposed the Genovese family's operations in detail. Witnesses testified about Tieri's role, about how orders flowed from him through the organization, about the criminal enterprises the family controlled. For years, Tieri had operated in shadows so deep that most Americans didn't know he existed. Now, his face was in newspapers, his name was on television, and his empire was being dismantled in federal court. In 1981, Frank Tieri was convicted on RICO charges and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. But the conviction was almost symbolic. Tieri was 77 years old and in poor health. The man who had survived decades in organized crime, who had built one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in American history, who had become the closest thing to a supreme mob leader, he would die in prison. But Tieri's real legacy wasn't about his conviction or death. It was about what he had built and how it survived. The Genovese family didn't collapse when he went to prison. The structure he had created, with its layers of insulation, its disciplined approach to criminal enterprise, its penetration into legitimate industries, continued operating. His successors adopted his methods: low profiles, sophisticated operations, avoiding unnecessary attention. The boss of bosses title disappeared with Tieri. No one else could command the respect or authority to claim it. But his influence persisted. The commission continued functioning. Families continued cooperating rather than warring. And the blueprint he had created for modern organized crime became the template others followed. Frank Tieri died in prison in 1981, just months after his conviction. He never served serious time, never faced the prolonged imprisonment that would destroy so many other bosses. In a way, even his death was perfectly timed. He went out before the real hammer fell, before RICO prosecutions decimated the mob, before the 5 families were reduced to shadows of their former power. What made Frank Tieri revolutionary wasn't violence or charisma. It was his understanding that organized crime needed to evolve to survive. The flashy gangster era was over. The days of Capone and Lucky Luciano, when bosses could operate semi-publicly, when mob influence was accepted as part of urban life, those days were gone. Tieri recognized this and adapted. His innovations became standard practice for surviving mob families. Insulation through layers, never be directly connected to crimes, use multiple intermediaries, maintain plausible deniability, operate through fronts and proxies, infiltration over confrontation. Instead of fighting the system, penetrate it. Control unions, corrupt officials, embed in legitimate industries. Make yourself too integrated to remove without destroying the entire system. Peace over war. Cooperation is more profitable than conflict. Build consensus, mediate disputes, maintain stability. Dead bosses and imprisoned soldiers don't generate revenue. Invisibility is strategy, fame is liability. The less law enforcement knows about you, the safer you are. Operate in shadows. Avoid attention. Let others take the spotlight and the risk. These principles didn't just apply to organized crime. Corporate criminals, corrupt politicians, financial fraudsters, they all learned that the most successful criminals are the ones nobody sees. Tieri's legacy extended beyond the mob into every form of systemic corruption. In the hierarchy of famous mob bosses, Frank Tieri's name barely registers. Most Americans know Capone, Gotti, Luciano, the celebrity gangsters who made headlines and became cultural icons. But among those who understand how power actually works, Tieri's reputation towers over all of them. Because Tieri achieved what no other mob boss managed. He became the undisputed leader of American organized crime without the title, without the recognition, without anyone outside the life really understanding his role. He commanded 5 families worth billions in criminal enterprise while living in a modest apartment and shopping at neighborhood stores. He was the most powerful gangster in America while remaining virtually unknown to the public. That's not failure, that's mastery. While Gotti played to cameras and ended up in prison, while other bosses got assassinated or prosecuted, Tieri ran the entire show from shadows so deep that law enforcement couldn't even confirm his position until they were ready to indict him. And even then, they only got him at 77, when he had already built a system that would outlive him. Today, the Genovese family still exists, diminished but enduring, operating many of the same rackets Tieri established decades ago. The family maintains its reputation as the most disciplined, the most sophisticated, the hardest to prosecute. That reputation is Tieri's legacy. The methods he pioneered, the insulation, the infiltration of legitimate industries, the avoidance of unnecessary violence, the careful management of relationships, became the survival guide for organized crime in the modern era. Law enforcement got better at prosecuting mob families, but the families that survived were the ones that learned Tieri's lessons. In a world where most mob stories end in prison or death, where empires collapse when their leaders fall, Tieri built something different. He built a system that transcended individuals, that could survive leadership changes, that embedded itself so deeply into legitimate society that removing it meant disrupting the entire system. That's not just power, that's immortality. Frank Tieri's story reveals an uncomfortable truth about power. The most dangerous people are the ones you never see. They don't appear on magazine covers, don't give interviews, don't have movies made about them. They operate in boardrooms and backrooms, making decisions that affect millions while remaining anonymous. They understand that visibility is vulnerability, that fame is a trap, that real power operates in shadows. Tieri proved that you don't need to be feared by everyone, you just need to be essential to the right people. He proved that empires built on systems outlast empires built on personalities. And he proved that the smartest criminals aren't the ones who commit the most spectacular crimes. They're the ones who never get caught until it's too late to matter. In the end, Frank Tieri won the game that almost everyone else loses. He rose from poverty to become the most powerful mob boss in America. He ruled for decades, survived every threat, built an empire that generated billions. And when they finally caught him, he was already dying of natural causes at 77, an age most mobsters never dream of reaching. The FBI called it a victory. But Tieri knew the truth. By the time they got him, he had already won. They say the loudest man in the room is the weakest. Frank Tieri was never the loudest. He was barely a whisper. But when he spoke, 5 families and an entire criminal empire listened. And in a world where gangsters chase fame and glory, the ghost who no one saw became the king they all feared.